So we're looking at the second reading from Aristotle's Politics, this section, this infamous section about slavery. Greek society, such as it was, made up of different regional Greek cities, Greek communities. There was no overall country of Greece in the ancient world. There were various city states, independent city states of various sizes, but there is a common culture, a common language, more or less a common religion, which is to say that Greek society was slave holding. That is, that slavery was a part of, I think, I don't know if there are any exceptions. Everything that I've read just indicates that at the time of Aristotle, slavery was just a universal thing in Greek cities and Greek communities, and that needs to be understood. That is, I'm not justifying what Aristotle says here, which is certainly a defense of slavery. There's just no question about it. The only question is, what sort of defense is it? And that's what's important to see. Um, Aristotle, as we saw last time, is trying to understand the city, the nation, the state. What sort of thing is it? And he has this procedure, which is, you could say, analytic or analysis. That the way that you understand a larger, complex whole, like a city, is by breaking it down into its parts and seeing how its parts are put together in such a way as to make up that complex whole. And the basic unit of the city is the household or family. Household is probably a pretty good translation of oikos, which is translated as family, I believe, in the last reading, but also translated as household. So he's trying to understand the household, and it was with a larger view of trying to understand the city, which is made up of households. But the household itself has parts, and the part that he's interested in here is the the part that consists of basically the relationship between master and servant or master and slave. Just sort of took it for granted that households would be composed not only of mother, father, children, whatever other blood relatives, and servants and slaves. That was just what he took for granted as the elements of the household. And he says something early on that I think needs to be emphasized. Uh, and that is, yes, in this reading, he will be attempting to provide some sort of justification of some notion of slavery, but Aristotle acknowledges that he is not, that everyone doesn't think like him. He says here at the end of this first section, others affirm that the rule of a master over slaves is contrary to nature, and that the distinction between slave and freeman exists by law only and not by nature, and being an interference with nature is therefore unjust. Which is interesting, right? Because it indicates that there was a plurality of opinion about the morality and justice of slavery in Aristotle's society, and there were some people whose opinion about it, I think, pretty much approaches our own modern people, that slavery is always unjust and that it is unnatural for one person to assume that sort of position of ownership over another person, that it's just inherently unjust. It can never be justified. It is always an interference with nature, in the sense we would say a violation of natural rights. So, yes, Aristotle's there's no question again that he's defending the institution or the institution of slavery in his own society, but we shouldn't presume, therefore, that everybody in Aristotle's time thought like him. He's giving us evidence right there that they didn't. So, yes, this is a defense of slavery, but how can you defend such a thing? Right? I think to the modern mind, that is the first question that emerges. How can you defend something like slavery? Um, I think that it really depends upon certain presumptions, certain principles. Uh, and if I can find it here, well, I mean, it's all over the place. But right here, beginning of part five, he asks a certain question. But is there anyone thus intended by nature to be a slave, for whom such a condition is expedient and right? Or rather, is not all slavery a violation of nature? That seems to be the question, right? That is, the latter part of that sentence where he asks rhetorically, is not all slavery a violation of nature? I think that modern people would say yes. But the earlier part of the sentence, is there anyone thus intended by nature to be a slave, and for whom such a condition is expedient and right? That's the crucial question for Aristotle. That is, if there are people who are by nature intended to be slaves, and for whom such a condition is expedient and right, then Aristotle says, then maybe not all slavery, but some slavery is justified. Um, and he argues that, right? Immediately, he says there is no difficulty in answering this question on grounds both of reason and of fact, for that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary, but expedient from the hour of their birth. Some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. So there's this grand and very big claim here that the answer to the question whether anyone's intended by nature to be a slave is yes. And his way of arguing is that some people are by nature, as he says, what is it? From the hour of their birth. Some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. That some of us are natural servants and some of us are natural rulers. And really, if you read it, I mean, you see that his argument is that this relationship of ruler over ruled is a natural one. And some are meant to rule and some are meant to be ruled. And um, that this relationship is good for both parties. That's really key. He does say that this is good for both parties, for those who are ruled and those who rule, um, which is a an absurd claim. I mean, it is an absurd claim. I think it's clearly false, but it's important to see not just as a justification for slavery, which is what it primarily is, but a global idea that there is a better and a worse, and that by nature the better is supposed to rule over the worse. Where does he talk about it? That this idea that the better needs to that there's a ruling principle is, he says, a global principle, not just in human relations but in nature. I mean, this is the bottom of page two, where he says, and there are many kinds both of rulers and subjects, and that rule is the better which is exercised over better subjects. For example, to rule over men is better than to rule over wild beasts. For the work is better which is executed by better workmen, and where one man rules and another is ruled, they may be said to have a work. For in all things, and this is the important part, for in all things which form a composite whole, and which are made up of parts, whether continuous or discrete, a distinction between the ruling and the subject element comes to light. That is, we saw this in Plato's theory of human nature, that inside the human being, there's a multi headed beast, there's a lion, and there's another human being. And the human being within the human being, which is our rational nature, is the ruling element. And the multi headed beast, which is our desires and our impulse to have pleasures, that's the part that's naturally obedient. So I hesitate to say that Aristotle was drawing from Plato here, because it's such a probably was such a general idea. But Aristotle, being Plato's student, he might have been influenced in that way. Aristotle continues by saying such a duality exists in living creatures, right here, but not in them only. It originates in the constitution of the universe. Even in things which have no life, there is a ruling principle, as in a musical mode. You see how he's using that analogy. It's like in a key, in a musical key in modern music, as I understand it, which is very little. There's a dominant tone, which in a certain sense rules all the others. Right? So, what Aristotle is suggesting is that the principle that there is a ruling element and a ruled element is a universal principle, and it's as true in music or nature as it is true in human relations. Um, and then he says, "We are okay, but we are wandering from the subject. We will therefore restrict ourselves to the living creature, which in the first place consists of soul and body, and of these two, the one is by nature the ruler, and the other the subject. That is, my soul rules over my body." And then he gets into a rather complicated description of the way that the ruling element of the soul rules over the body, and the way that the ruling element within the soul rules over other elements within the soul. We would get to that in class, but so there's a definitely a I don't know if it's an argument or a rationalization really about Aristotle's defense of slavery. Um, that is, this ultimately this idea that some of us are born to rule and some of us are born to be ruled, and that is just a universal principle of nature. Now, the for him, the really complicated thing is saying, well, are all master servants or all master slave relationships really the rule of the better over the worse, or that's what he has to take up. Is that really true?